what I want to say is, I'm not a constitutional or law expert, and the idea is that with any Agora seminar, we're going to come to the text together, and we're going to try to dig into what the author is saying. In this case, it's Hamilton. And before we decide whether Hamilton is right or wrong, we're going to first spend most of our time deciding or investigating what he means. So that's kind of the primary goal of what we're trying to do. And maybe at the end we can get to whether, he's right or wrong, and we can also get to, have we diverged from Hamilton's vision, right? But first we want to understand his vision. So if it's okay, what I would love to do is start on page 1 of Federalist Paper 70, and I'll read starting about line 28, and I'm going to conclude at line 32, and I'll ask you about it. More people are coming. This is great. So I'm going to start. Taking it for granted, therefore, that all men of sense will agree in the necessity of an energetic executive, it will only remain to inquire, what are the ingredients which constitute this energy? How far can they be combined with those other ingredients which constitute safety in the Republican sense? And how far does this combination characterize the plan which has been reported by the convention? So here's this is going to lead to my question. The ingredients which constitute energy in the executive are, first, unity; secondly, duration; thirdly, an adequate provision for its support; fourthly, competent powers. So my question to you is, what do you think about these ingredients?
I think you need to read the next sentence, Andy, because the whole
Okay, all right. The ingredients which constitute safety in the Republican sense are, first, a due dependence on the people; secondly, a due responsibility.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, maybe we need to define what do they mean by unity?
Yeah.
Is that what you're asking us?
I forgot to mention one thing. So there's a bunch of new people here, and so what I want to say is we want to have as much as we can an organic conversation, but if you find that you are trying to come in and having a hard time, if you click on the participants button, you will see on the right hand side there's a place where you can say raise your hand. If you raise your hand, I will see it, and then I'll be able to call on you. And also, if you start talking and you realize someone else is talking, you might yield and then come in later, and I'll try to keep track of all of that. So Francine asked, what do we mean by unity? What do you guys think about that?
I think it means one person.
Yeah, one thing.
Simple one. Yeah. The other point to make, which we talked about last week, is what the word energy means in this context.
Yes.
It really means power. So energetic means powerful, I think. And somebody can disagree with me, but I thought that's where we ended up.
Yeah. Larry, your hands up.
If the issue is unity, what we're discussing is unity.
Yeah.
A little after that, it says how unity can be destroyed, which gives a very clear indication of what they mean by unity. If that's what we're discussing, unity.
Sure.
Because it says this unity may be destroyed in two ways, either by vesting the power in two or more magistrates of equal dignity and authority, or by vesting it ostensibly in one man, subject in whole or in part to the control and cooperation of others in the capacity of counselors to him.
Right. So that's on page 2, line 13 or so. So Arthur, I think what you're pointing us to is that it's not unity in the sense of creating unity or whatever. It's more like a unified singularity, right? One person.
One person.
Yeah.
Mary, you're going to say.
Well, on the point of unity, it seemed to me that David was right, that unity means you want one, not a council, not a sharing of equal, etc.
Yeah.
But I thought David, before that, a kind of preparatory, I noticed in reading this particular piece that those things that were indicated on the first page,
Yeah.
that this particular Federalist paper does not address all of them. And it seems that it made me think that I should look at, the 71, 72, because it seemed to me that that's what I would have anticipated, that he's continuing these things, but I didn't have time to do that.
I strongly agree. Because he usually does a great job of saying, this is what I'm going to talk about. And here on the front page, he says, there are 4 ingredients. And he proceeds to talk about 1.
Right. Yeah.
And part of 2, he gets into part of 2, I think, at the bottom of the first page, but that's only part of 2. And
it goes up through 73. So each one is like a certain aspect of energy.
Yes.
So
so there's 3
71
more
is,
to come then.
yeah, 71 is the 4-year term. 72 is re-eligibility. They can be reelected. 73 is the veto power.
Right.
So he comes back to each of those things.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so he took 4 papers to do these 4 points.
Yeah. He doesn't mention the veto power here, but he gets to it in 73.
Uh-huh.
And also, we touched on it before, right? In other Federalist Papers, he talks about in the balance of powers, that absolute negation, right? That veto power that the president has balances, like, all the constituencies. So,
right.
Yeah, exactly right. So then I guess what I want to ask is, let's see. I'm going to page 2 now, and I'm wondering, let's see. Basically, what I'm really curious about the wisdom of how this is put out, and that is that there's energy versus deliberation and wisdom, right? So I'm at the top of page 2, and it's line 1. Those politicians and statesmen who have been the most celebrated for their soundness of their principles and for the justice of their views have declared in favor of a single executive and a numerous legislature. They have, with great propriety, considered energy as the most necessary qualification of the former, and have regarded this as the most applicable to power in a single hand, while they have, with equal propriety, considered the latter, the legislature, as best adapted to deliberation and wisdom, and best calculated to conciliate the confidence of the people and to secure their privileges and interests. So what do you guys think of that? I mean, does it seem wise?
Well, of course, in fairness, he's not saying that's my opinion. He's saying other people have said this.
True.
Yeah, it's the paragraph of authority. These are the authorities that are going to sort of stand with what we're saying here.
Right.
Yeah. But isn't it consistent with what we said before, what we've been saying in some of these previous discussions?
Uh-huh.
Namely, that you want to have going back to the even very beginning ones about how to suppress the factions.
Mm-hmm.
So you really want to have a number of people that work in it. And you also, well, anyway, just that minor point.
No, actually, I think you're saying something really interesting. So it seems to me what you're saying is that there's a virtue in having many people deliberate, and there's a virtue in having one person act, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what I think you're pointing to, and I guess that's what these different branches of government are trying to do in this paragraph, if I'm getting you right.
Yeah, Congress is good at at deliberating,
right?
Bringing everybody together and going through the whole process of making law. Yeah. Presidents are good at acting.
Hold on one second. I need Miriam.
So I think when I look at this too, I think David used the word power also as
Yeah.
equivalent to energy. I think it is also the ability to execute on that power and to carry something out. So it felt to me like what he was trying to say is that if you have that one man who is able, it was one man in this case, but that one executive who is able, it's how they carry out that power and how they complete whatever it is, whether it's the deliberations of the legislature, whatever it is that they're trying to complete in terms of, it's the ability to execute and act on those things. And I think that's also what I'm thinking is synonymous with energy in this case. So the more I kept thinking about it, it's, we've had presidents who've had great ideas, but failed to be able to execute. They couldn't carry out the thing for whatever reason, whether they didn't have the legislature behind them as their check or something else, or they didn't have, a cabinet that could carry things out. But being able to carry those out, I think, is one of the things that he's talking about with energy.
Yeah, I think you and I have talked about this in the past. We've talked about the entrepreneurial spirit of the executive, right? That he or she can accomplish things individually. That's a kind of a virtue that we want, right? I mean, hopefully we do want that. That makes sense. So then, actually, if I could go, I'm still on page 2. Kind of
Before you, Andy,
please,
before you
go
leave
ahead.
that,
Yeah.
it does seem to me if you just say power, it's a little too broad. I mean, it's clearly very limited by the legislature.
Right.
Entrepreneurs he's in a what these guys designed as a fairly tight box. And he had certain things he was authorized to do and certain things he couldn't do unless there was a war or something. So it's definitely power, but it's definitely power within the executive. It's executive power. It's limited by that
power with a purpose, like inherently with a purpose.
Right.
That's what
power
he's
with a
getting at.
purpose, and a lot of times the purpose is given by the legislature, not his own.
Well, no, I think that's actually that's an excellent point, that the executive has power, but it's limited and it's also scrutinized, right? So, no, that's, I mean, in a way, you could say that's very much a tension right now, right? That comes into the kind of current press right now, is that it's being, presidents push the power, right? Not just this current president, but all presidents.
Or they don't use the power. I mean, that's I think another piece that if we want to talk about contemporary situations, if we talk about the Defense Production Act or something, I think one of the things the states are complaining about right now is the lack of clear direction and clear. I mean, by if you have the Defense Production Act and you as the executive demand that these companies turn around and start making PPE, that is your prerogative. You can do that. But if it's not done, if it's not executed or not completely executed, the reality is the states are left to try and negotiate this all on their own. And I think it's that lack of execution and clarity that has been part of the problem with our current.
Sure. Are they trying to do a job description? They really didn't write like a job description for the president here. And do you think this is the closest to a job description that we have? Unity, duration, adequate provisions for support, and competent powers? Because that's very broad. Yeah. And aren't we beginning to see that maybe we do need a little more definition in our job description of president?
I think that's a really good point. It seems like all they wrote was what the barriers are or what the boundaries are, right? Sean.
Yeah, I like that Francine's idea of a job description for the president, because as I read Hamilton, I pick up on the idea about, separating and checking power. But I think his argument here is more why the executive branch, as the executive branch, should be run by an individual as opposed to a plurality or a council.
Yeah, Doug, you had your hand up.
Yes, conditions of employment is what I round that up to say. Because, in other words, turn over your tax returns when you start, things like that, instead of rules and norms. So I had the same question as Francine. Is there anything in any of these that do a better job of defining it? But I haven't seen anything to date. But again, a condition of employment. You do this if you're going to be president. Something other than whatever it is, Article 1, 2, 215, whatever the heck it is. Yeah, it's.
Andy, sorry, where's the hand thing? I'm not finding it.
If you click on
participants
at the bottom, you'll see all the participants on the side, and then you could say raise your hand.
Got it. Okay.
Arthur, your hand's up. You're muted right now, though.
Okay, now can you hear me?
Yes.
I was just going to say that Hamilton, he's clearly comparing the governor's experience. The governor, is it New York where he was?
Yeah, right.
Hamilton's from, because the very last sentence, of number 70, he says, I rarely met with an intelligent man from any of the states who did not admit, as the result of experience, that the unity, all in caps, of the executive of this state was one of the best of the distinguishing features of our Constitution. But
right.
I mean, it seems obvious to me, at least, that a governor and a president, they act in the capacity of a CEO, and they have to move quickly because in many different situations they can't deliberate like a legislature for a long period of time. And that seems to me, that's the energy. And he's clearly, again, he's using governors of certain states. I think he uses New Jersey also as an example.
Yeah.
But of people who need to step in and take action.
Yeah. Larry, your hand up.
Arthur just said what I was going to say on page 2, right in that third paragraph. He brings up New York and New Jersey as 2 states that have a single executive in comparison to other states that have a kind of council and so forth, right? And then he really comes back the way you concluded. The very end of this, of number 70 that we're reading, is drilling that in. You don't want a council, and not even the case this equal but 2, right? He's got a little bit of historical evidence he can look to with respect to Rome, with respect to having 2 councils.
Yeah.
But he kind of goes into that, I thought, to sort of say, even there, they found, even though there's kind of a limited situation there, just and it's ancient, even they found that they were better off when they divided. The one council would say, okay, you do this 1 year, and I'll take care of the 4 in the next year, and the next time we'll switch.
Yeah.
So you're going to only have 1 CEO, as you put it.
Right. Kevin, your hand's up.
If you go to that paragraph above, he points out there can be no need to that paragraph. Second sentence, though, a feeble executive implies a feeble execution of government. So it's really interesting thing about this paper is that he wasn't concerned about presidents being too powerful. He was concerned about them being too weak.
Yeah.
And so you wonder, where are we getting this concern today that the presidency is too powerful, the imperial presidency and all this kind of stuff?
Right.
That he was worried that the energy would dissipate, that we'd have presidents that were too weak. Because a feeble execution is another phrase for bad execution. And a government ill executed, whatever it is in theory, is in practice bad government. Yeah. So he hoped that the Constitution would actually empower presidents and not limit them. And if you look at the way the Constitution is written, there are no specific limits on the president. It gives him roles and duties and just says go. And then fight it out with Congress, obviously, in checks and balances. But it's incredible that this paper insists that the Constitution, can actually create power. That's law doesn't usually do that. Law limits things, but not the Constitution.
No, right, yeah. Barry, your hand's up.
I wanted to go back to the intentionality of the paper, and I'm recalling that I think Hamilton would be expecting that people are looking at the job description as laid out in the Constitution, and what he's really attempting to do with this paper is persuade people that that job description is the right one. So
Right.
he does end up giving elements of a job description, but I don't think it's his primary purpose. So with regard, for example, to the limitations, he does indicate that he wants to address the limitations on presidential power. In fact, Andy, you had read this. It'd be in line 30 on page 1.
Yeah.
How far can they be combined? That's the vigorousness of the presidency and so forth.
Yeah.
With those other ingredients which constitute safety in the Republican sense.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, exactly right. David, your hand's up.
I raised my hand because I'm a little bothered by the term job description, since I think this is really much more about structure of the government. Description would come at some later time. The other point to make, and it really isn't for another page or so, is that by having a unity, a single person, you know who's responsible. You know where the buck stops. And that's really important. You can't pass the buck, well, somebody else's fault. And I think
David, on that point, I think he's really strong about that, and that's his argument about why you shouldn't have 2 or more people in there, is because you'll never know who to point the finger at or who to be held accountable for.
right. And I think applied to the current day, we might wonder if that's as effective currently as it ought to be.
No, actually, so to me, actually, I kind of found this paper so pointed in a way, right? Which is that, as Steve just pointed out, you want to know who to blame for things coming up. Eric, your hand's up.
Yeah, does holding the president, the executive accountable, does the ability to do that dissipate with the growth of the executive branch? In other words,
Would you repeat that, please?
Oh, go ahead.
No, would you repeat what you just said again?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, does the I said it rather haltingly.
Yeah.
Does the people's ability to hold the executive responsible dissipate even as the executive branch grows? In other words, the president still has, the president is one person, but an enormous number of people, and Hamilton might well have foreseen this. I mean, he himself came to be a member of the first cabinet a few years after this. And you know, Washington had a divided cabinet. He and Jefferson hated each other. So, you know, does the president's how easy is it to hold the president accountable, even if he has a small number of advisors? And isn't it inevitable that he will have some number of advisors?
Yeah, Kevin, your hand's up.
Yeah, to answer that question, he appoints them, you know, through the appointment power confirmed by the Senate and everything. So that way he makes sure that he stands at the top of the executive branch. But you're right, though. I mean, by the time of the 20th century, especially by the time of the New Deal era and FDR, right, the executive branch just expands outward in all directions. You start to get these independent executive agencies he has no direct control over, and the energy dissipates. You lose it. And the energy is placed instead in executive agencies instead of into the guy who's elected for that purpose.
Yeah.
So that's
what's interesting, Kevin. Actually, what I would think what people would criticize would be not that the energy dissipates or the authority dissipates, but that the cabinet grows such that it's insulary, right? So in other words, the president's power gets consolidated and it grows.
Right.
Right. Barry, your hand up. Barry.
Yeah, I was thinking that Hamilton would probably respond to that question by saying the president can have as many advisors as he wants, but he's ultimately responsible for what happens in the executive.
Yeah. No, I agree. Larry.
Yeah, just following up what Kevin said, I had thought the same thing when the question was asked earlier about the expansion of the executive power. And I thought right away of FDR. And I thought there where you really began it, but I was hesitant to do that because people feel so strongly about that matter one way or another that I didn't want to bring it up. But coming back to the point here about how you hold them accountable, it seemed to me at this juncture, one of the principal means of holding them accountable we already talked about previously, and that is the impeachment power, right? Was one of those. The second and more common would be that you throw them out of office, right? So this was why I was contrasting to the monarch in England. We're not a monarchy, right? And you're only going to have a limited term, and that term is going to only be a short period of time, but it's got to be long enough so they can actually accomplish what they want, right? So I think
Federal 71.
Yeah, some of them were 3 years at the time in New York, perhaps.
Right.
4 years is about it. But anyway.
But it is the when he talks about the King's Council, I assume he's talking about the Privy Council
In England.
Yeah.
Yeah, and didn't he? Surely he could foresee that the president was going to have around him what would come to be called a cabinet, whether the name doesn't matter, but that I mean, how different is that really?
Wouldn't you throw him out in any event? When you remove him from office by electing someone else, they're going to go as well. But with respect to the King of England, I thought he was saying even there that helped a bit, but people could complain at that point about the council. So they've already given up a massive amount of power to the monarch, but these were the things that they had to sort of put checks on it.
Yeah. Arthur, your hand's up.
So, excuse me. I was gonna just add something to what Kevin and Larry said, because I made a note when I was reading this, and I can't tell you because like I have the book or whatever, and it says, but no favorable circumstances palliate or atone for the disadvantages of dissension in the executive department. Here, they are pure and unmixed. There is no point at which they cease to operate. They serve to embarrass and weaken the execution of the plan or measure to which they relate from the first step to the final conclusion of it. What popped in my mind at that point, if the executive department is so expansive that when and I mean this issue came up, of course, and the term I'm about to throw out was a term that was thrown out when Trump or when the current president came to power. If there's dissension, then that causes issues, and the term that was discussed was the deep state. So so there is the issue of a president comes in and he inherits the executive staff of the former administration, and then it's inherent in you immediately have the problems, as will when there's another change in administration. They're going to face the same issues.
Yeah. Dave, you have your hand up.
No, I do, but I see Norm has his hand up physically.
We're going to get to Norman in a second.
No, Norm.
Okay, Norman.
Yeah, just it seems to me that going back to energy and what Hamilton has to say at page 2 in a number of places, paragraph 10 among others, decision, activity, secrecy, dispatch, you want to have a decision and you may need to have it made quickly.
Yeah.
And so that has a lot to do with the single executive.
Yeah, I totally agree. Dave, you want to go back?
I want to get back to the question of whether the large government somehow unempowers the president. And we see today that we have the biggest government ever. We're getting rid of a lot of civil servants by various means. This president has responsibility, whether he takes it or not is another matter. So I think it's clearly within the purview, within the energy of the presidency, even in a very, very large government, much larger than Hamilton probably ever imagined.
Yeah.
Because he will influence things. His ability, yes, he has to have his appointees approved, but he can fire them.
True.
It's a powerful position.
It is. Sarah, your hand's up. I mean, it's not Sarah. You're.
Oh, it's Carl.
Okay,
Sorry.
I'll change your name.
Sarah,
Carl. Hold on.
Yeah, 2 quick points. I think that, and I think the first one somebody made earlier, that when he's talking about unity and the ways to destroy it, it's if you have, in essence, a co-president with equal dignity or authority.
Yeah.
Or by vesting it ostensibly in one man, subject in whole or in part to the control or cooperation of others. And that's not the case with the cabinet at all. I think as far as unity goes, we've maintained that. And there are, some independent agencies like the Fed, but by and large, all the increase in the availability of power that the president has is because Congress has given him that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And they could take away those powers and those agencies and those things if they wanted or were willing to.
Yeah.
I think Hamilton would be concerned about the size of government. He didn't want an elective king.
Mm-hmm.
He really didn't want that. The Article 1 is the legislature. He really saw the legislature as being the most powerful piece. Yeah. And we've gotten away from that. And I think that's kind of the dominant fact here. Do we really want the president with all kinds of energy if he's been given way too much power to begin with?
No, I think you're pointing to something really important, actually, is that it's not the same thing as a entrepreneur, right? In other words, they're restrained in some really important ways, and they push that, and the legislature has that oversight. That seems super important. Francine, your hand's up.
Well, in this whole thing, there's no discussion. One of our largest issues now is our foreign relations and the Secretary of State. And that's totally under the power of the president. But yet, do we see anything in here that addresses his influence?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the Secretary of State. Did they ever think that it would be as involved as it is today, how important it is today in the world?
Well, remember, we've talked about this in the past, that like treaties have to be approved by the Senate, for example. I mean, in other words, the president can't by himself or herself, sign these treaties, but they have a huge influence, obviously, right, in terms of public relations. Kevin, your hand's up.
Yeah, back to understand the structure of the executive branch.
Yeah.
President at the top, cabinet and immediate advisors, but then beneath them, you have independent agencies. So the president can fire people immediately close to him. He can't fire independent agencies. There was a Supreme Court case that ruled on that in 1935. Mm-hmm. So that's an example of, again, the energy dissipating. As a result, presidents have to compensate for it with power. So you see, back to the power energy distinction we talked about, the way that the executive branch evolves after FDR, presidents come into office and it's like this massive nebulous thing. They can't gain control of it. It's very, very hard, but they have to assert even more power because the energy has been taken away. So
that's fascinating. Arthur, go ahead.
Is the CEC independent?
Oh, sorry, you're muted, Arthur.
I'm unmuted now.
Okay.
I was just going to say, there's certain circumstances that are different today than they were, at the time when the Federalist Papers were written. So, for example, the president being the commander-in-chief. Back then, I mean, given the way wars and things were, you didn't have to act with such dispatch as you do today. So in certain circumstances, it seems that even more energy is required and more ability to take quick action because of the way things are today. To make a decision, for example, like to take out Osama bin Laden. I mean, if that had gone to the legislature for a decision, he'd still be alive, I think. But so then the only other thing, and then I'll mute myself again. In 78, when in talking about the judiciary, he uses the metaphor of sword and purse, the sword being the president and the purse being the legislature, which to me kind of gives also an idea of how he envisaged an executive, the president's powers. So.
No, actually, I'm so glad you brought that up, right? So, yeah, you say, there's the sword and then there's the purse, and you have the judiciary who's like the least powerful of the three, right? So, yeah, it creates a kind of a tempered view of this. Again, I'm using the word entrepreneur, right? So it's an entrepreneur with a yoke. I guess is how I was thinking about it, or something like that. Something like that. So let's see. I feel like does anybody have any questions? Because I feel like we kind of mostly covered it. This Federalist paper was generally why would you have a one person versus a council? Did anybody have any questions about that, other than what we already talked about?
There's the one obvious thing that comes up on in page 4. When he's considering the who's going to be blamed, etc. And he'll look into the various accusations. That top paragraph there. Right. He says the following. Right. The council was so divided in their opinions, it was impossible to obtain any better resolution to the point. End quote. These and similar pretexts are constantly at hand, whether true or false. And who is there that will either take the trouble or incur the odium of a strict scrutiny into the secret springs of this transaction? Should there be found a citizen zealous enough to undertake the unpromising task, if there happen to be collusion between the parties concerned, how easy it is to clothe the circumstances with so much ambiguity as to render it uncertain what was the precise conduct of any of those parties. Aren't we talking about obviously the press has come into a role that doesn't seem to be considered. We talked about political parties in the past, not being anticipated. It seems to me that this sort of who do you blame and who's behind all of this is something that I think as I was growing up, that was sort of presented in our civics class as what the press would do. The press was the one that would kind of investigate these various allegations, and they're going to clean it up, and that they've got the zeal. And it seems to me that in experience of our times, the press are extremely zealous. And they're at work on all those things all the time. But that's not directly connected to this, but it occurred to me in reading 70.
No, I agree with you. And I guess I would also say that at some point you really want to be able to say who is responsible for this action that has been undertaken, right? And so even if it was a cabinet person or an appointee or whatever, you want to say the executive authorized it, right? And so, that seems completely legitimate. So actually, if we go to page 4, line 20, I'll just read that paragraph and we can see as a kind of maybe an encapsulation of this issue. It is evident from these considerations that the plurality of the executive tends to deprive the people of the two greatest securities they can have for the faithful exercise of any delegated power. First, the restraints of public opinion, I think this is touching on what you mentioned, Larry, which lose their efficacy as well on account of the division of the censure attendant on bad measures among a number, as on account of the uncertainty on whom it ought to fall. And secondly, the opportunity of discovering with facility the clearness, the misconduct of the persons they trust, in order either to their removal from office or to their actual punishment in cases which admit of it. Dave, your hand's up.
Yep, unfortunately, I think I lost my thread. Does anybody believe that things go on in our government and the executive branch which don't get blamed on the president today?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, like your example is sort of like the economy, right? You'd say the economy has such a sort of a long lag that the president takes credit or doesn't for something he didn't actually bring about, right?
Not surprising that the president wants credit when it's positive and doesn't accept the blame when it's negative. That's normal.
Yeah.
But if any agency of the federal government does something, it's almost always reported as the Trump administration did X.
Yeah.
You're not. It's still very much in the lap of the president.
Yeah.
Many of those great talking heads, I love the heads we've got here. I think some of these are much better than what I see on television. Oh, well, it's going to be a referendum on how well he handled the coronavirus thing.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's lots he doesn't do, but there's lots he does do.
Yeah, no, for sure. Arthur, your hand's up. You're muted, Arthur.
Actually, David kind of touched on what I was going to say, because the way it's set up, and for governors too, governors have the same responsibility as a president, to a large extent. Even if they have nothing to do with something, if it happens on their watch, they're responsible. And, they get blamed for it. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I wrote next to one of the paragraphs here, or some of the sentences I wrote, scapegoat role or whatever. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I mean, it seems to be built into the system. But yeah, it's, something happens, like to a CEO also, if something happens, under his or her watch, he's responsible, even if he had nothing to do with it. So that seems to be a part of the way this works.
Now, I just want to bring up people in this group, and in, when we did the Foundations of Our Republic in the past, people had brought up this notion that a council of equal power and authority can, in a way, bring about more wise advice, right, than an individual. So that's been brought up here in the past, and I don't know, I see the difficulty of that, which is who to blame. You might have to act quickly. I totally get all that, but I guess I just want to ask you, it seems to me the case is being made that there's a virtue in having an individual person versus a council, but people, I don't know, a council can offer wise advice, I guess. I don't know. What do you think?
I think that a council that acts as in an advising capacity to the CEO, president, governor, to whoever, is a wise thing, especially if it's something beyond the ken of the executive, and should listen to it. But ultimately, what the executive decides, he's on the hook for it no matter what. So, yeah.
Carl, your hand's up. You're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, I was gonna make kind of the same point. I mean, if David, I think, made the point earlier that nobody thinks Trump does this stuff. Any good CEO, best advice he possibly can, and then makes his decisions. And he's obviously going to make a lot of decisions where there's a ton of unknowns.
Yeah.
But it's kind of the same point in things that aren't related to the immediate. Some kind of emergency. That wisdom is supposed to come from the legislature. Do we go to war with these folks? We're going to spend. We don't declare war anymore. But I mean, it's kind of a bad example. But the Congress, ideally, that's where the wisdom and the discussion and the compromises all come to out and are surfaced and are engaged in, with the whole political element to it.
Yeah.
They charge the president with, we're going to war with this guy, and the president hopefully gets advice from generals and allies and everybody else involved in being successful in prosecuting that war. And that the energy is limited that way. And wisdoms from the legislature and expertise, that's up to the president to get in executing what's legislated. That's why I took it.
You bring up a really good point. And in fact, even the language in the Federalist Papers is that it's in the legislature that you set up deliberation, right? So people are going to be talking, and that's the point. Steve, your hand's up.
It sounds like it's probably been made, but I'll just reiterate just through example. I mean, I think examples, I think I brought this up last time, but I remember Team of Rivals by Doris Kearns Goodwin, Lincoln's book about his cabinet and how absolutely diverse opinions were constant in his administration, as it was even in Obama's administration. I think he had John Kerry and Samantha Powers and Susan Rice and people who disagreed about a lot of items and issues and brought stuff to the table. But I think that the energy part of the executive is being able to take those things into mind and making clear, deliberate action. And I think that's, but again, considering all of those opinions, that's where you find a really good executive who takes those things in mind and then has that ability to go and act afterwards. So,
well, it seems to me you're bringing up a really important point for any executive, and that would be you don't have a group of people that have the same opinion, right? In other words, you're hearing many voices, right? Francine, your hand's up.
Well, I think I'm kind of going on what Steve says is that the executive, the cabinet is to help him. We always know, if you want a good decision, it takes longer. A quality decision takes longer. A quick decision is not always as good. And so he has his cabinet to confer with. And I think that contradicts when you say entrepreneur, I'm thinking the person who's out there making the decisions, acting quickly. And that's not exactly what we want in the president. We want a quality decision. And that's why this is, don't know that it gets diluted. It gets more quality the more opinions you have.
Yeah. Dave, your hand's up.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to slightly disagree with Hamilton. I think he left off something really important about the unity. And that is, when one person has the ultimate responsibility, that person is pressed to make the best possible decision. Think about what Francis was saying about quality and the importance of quality and the need for collecting input to make a quality decision. Like
the million viewers over the weekend, 16% higher than the.
Hold on, something just happened.
And now California, New York, and Texas said today.
Andy, can you hear me?
Yes, but we're hearing a lot of other stuff. Hold on one second, Miriam. I'm going to call on you in 1 second.
All right, let me finish.
Go ahead, Dave.
I think that by giving a single person the responsibility and the ultimate blame, we are pushing them to make the best quality decision because of the burden of that responsibility.
Yeah, no, I agree with you.
Thing which he doesn't mention.
Right. Okay. Miriam, hold on.
I think is really important, the oversight committee. What part does that play? And did that come up in the Federalist Times? And when did that oversight committee, form? And if a person has nothing to hide, why would they not accept an oversight committee? I think it's really important, but that's my opinion.
Yeah, I'm going to mute you again, Miriam, because there's some other signal coming through on your channel.
Okay.
But no, I mean it's completely a valid point, right? Like oversight makes sense for somebody who doesn't have anything to hide, I guess. I was going to read, if you go to page 5, the end of our reading for today. We're not going to get to 78, but we'll do that next time. So let's see. I'm about 5 lines from the top, but I do not, and I'm on page 5. But I do not think the rule at all applicable to the executive power. I clearly concur in opinion in this particular with a writer whom the celebrated Junius pronounced to be deep, solid, and ingenuous, that the executive power is more easily confined when it is one that it is far more safe. There should be a single object for the jealousy and watchfulness of the people, and in a word, that all multiplication of the executive is rather dangerous than friendly to liberty. So I guess I was thinking the people who are reading this kind of situation, they're trying to say, we don't want a king. Obviously, we've heard that many times, but then we want this powerful executive that is friendly to liberty, but has the right kind of power, I guess, or power that is fenced in, or something like that. I don't know. I don't know if you have that same reaction or not, but.
I strongly agree with that.
Yeah.
Even if I don't like the guy we got now, I think it's a really, really important structure.
Yeah, I agree. And I guess what I would say is, in a way, if you said it'd be attractive in a way to say, wouldn't it be better to have a committee of people in the executive branch? But there's something really, I don't know, at least what the Federalist Papers is trying to show is there's something important about having somebody who has the vigor and the authority to act in ways that he or she can, right? And quickly. Larry, your hand's up.
Yeah, I just wanted to taking the point that David gave, it seems to me that when you look at the sorts of people that have political ambition, and it seems, given that they're so full of their own ego, and a sense of their own honor and greatness, that when you have committees that have a number of those types of people available, it's just not going to be a good thing.
Yeah.
You need to stick with someone, and all those other egos need to step back. And that's so difficult for human nature, particularly people that have political ambition and think they know about what's good and best for everybody.
Yeah.
So I just want to endorse that suggestion that David made.
Arthur, your hand's up.
There was one part of this Federalist number 70 that I actually copied. And then I have friends from all over the political spectrum. And so I copied this and sent it to them. And I don't know where it is, on terms of pages. And I know you all read it. It's the paragraph that starts, men often oppose a thing merely because they have had no agency in planning it.
Precisely.
Or because it may have been planned by those whom they dislike.
Yes.
But if they have been consulted and have happened to disapprove, opposition then becomes, in their estimation, an indispensable duty of self-love. They seem to think themselves bound in honor and by all the motives of personal infallibility to defeat the success of what has been resolved upon. Contrary to their sentiments, men of upright, benevolent tempers have too many opportunities of remarking with horror to what desperate lengths this disposition is sometimes carried, and how often the great interests of society are sacrificed to the vanity, to the conceit, and to their passions and their caprices interesting to mankind. Perhaps the question now before the public may, in its consequences, afford melancholy proofs of the effects of this despicable frailty, or rather detestable vice, in the human character.
I'm so glad you brought that up.
Excellent.
Yes, excellent.
Well, I mean, what you're pointing to is that real good work or good wisdom can be thwarted by, the lesser parts of us, right? Things that are not best about us. Kevin, your hand's up.
Yeah, this is where you really see the genius of the Constitution and the Federalist Papers, is in the way that it was so willing to admit how bad people are.
Yeah.
And how ambition so deeply corrupts them. But then instead of trying to flush that out of the government, invite it in and let it be the engine that makes the system work. So if you look at like Federal 72, he talks about you want ambitious presidents because as ugly as ambition is, it's a vice, it's useful and it makes the system work. And you can channel that ambition into energy. So instead of trying to beat the tyrant, join it and then use it to the public advantage. That's the brilliance of these papers.
We've talked about this a few times in the past, and that is that the authors of this and the Constitution that we have basically counted on the maybe whatever you want to call it, the lesser parts of human quality or whatever, and they said we're going to count on ambitions, countering ambitions, and they will have to come together and come to a compromise, right? To
And underlying all of it, sorry, Denny.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm just thinking, underlying all of it is this notion of a limited government.
Yeah.
That the government itself is going to have real limitations and not be so ambitious itself as to accomplishing all these great goods that sound so wonderful, that appeal to people's initial passions.
Yeah.
You know.
Rachel, your hand's up. You're muted though. There you go.
Yeah, so we just talked about that, the paragraph, the following paragraph that starts with upon the principles of a free government.
Yeah.
So that's where I started to get a little bit confused. I wanted some clarification. So 3 or 4 sentences down, it says, it is here too that they must be the most pernicious. In the legislature, promptitude of decision is most oftener an evil than a benefit. And we talked a little bit about that. We need to be able to deliberate and slow down and make the best choice. But I didn't understand the sentence says, when a resolution to is once taken, the opposition must be at an end. That resolution is a law and resistance to it punishable, but no favorable circumstances palliate or atone for the disadvantages of dissension in the executive department. So I was a little bit confused there. And I wanted to see if someone could clarify that for me.
Yeah. Eric, your hand's up.
Well, I sort of want to speak to that question, but I just wondered if what Hamilton has denominated as the ingredients of energy have in our system come to be at odds with each other. I mean, on the one hand, and I wonder if this speaks to, actually in a way, to Rachel's question. Here's what I mean. The unity, the very unity that is requisite for energy, also needs the help of competent powers. I take it that the various parts of a complex executive branch of a government are those competent powers, but those very same powers can seem to be able to diffuse the president's ability to act, or at least his what looks like his responsibility for acting. So you can get a president like the one we have now who can say, I take no responsibility. The buck doesn't stop with me. You know, it's the exact opposite of what Harry Truman said. And so trying to come back to what Rachel asked, that passage, but I don't have it immediately in front of me.
It's page 3, line 19.
Yeah, I'm looking at a different text.
Oh, right.
I mean, I've got the book in hand.
I was talking about resolution. So are we discussing once Congress has passed a law, or is that something different?
I wondered about that too. I mean, because can't the president just easily, it almost seemed to me that a parliamentary system as it exists now would suit Hamilton better in a way, because you can act much more directly. You can enact a policy much more directly than is possible now. If the president and the legislature are at odds with each other, even if a law is passed, we're seeing now the president can say, I'm not going to do it, or I'm not going to. The question that I think Miriam asked before, I'm not going to obey the requests of an oversight committee.
Yeah.
Sean, that has a force of law. That's extraordinary.
Yeah.
Well, I can think the one that really got to me was it says once a resolution to is once taken, the opposition must be at an end.
Right.
What does that mean? Because we fight laws all the time in the Supreme Court.
He's talking about his relationship with his cabinet. That's what that is. So in other words, like the president has to be able to make a final decision and not have his cabinet second guess him.
Executive
So
policy.
Yeah,
So it
one party's
says
talking.
the resolution is a law.
Well, the decision is final. Because
So
it was
that
possible
was-
that
Okay.
In the legislature, they pass a law,
Uh-huh.
like it and some don't. But just as Rachel said, if there's opposition to it, it goes away from the legislature, unless they want to go and amend about Obamacare, which look how hard that was.
Yeah.
On the executive side, there is no clear statement of the decision that then would have to be overturned.
Uh-huh.
It's more malleable.
Yeah.
That's the distinction that's being made.
Yeah, that makes sense. Sean, you were going to say.
I was fascinated by that too as well, Rachel. And the way I read that first half of the paragraph that you read was him extolling the virtues of the deliberative process, like, hey, this is a good thing. You have the difference of opinions. You can sometimes obstruct good plans, but oftentimes you're just thinking about things nicely. And I think he's talking about the legislative process there. And he says, but once we vote on it and it's a law, then it's a law, it's at an end. I think that's what he means by that. And he follows that up with, but I don't think this is a good method for running an executive branch. I think he says, hey, this is great, this deliberation, and it's a good check, but I think the way to read it is, hey, it fits really well in the legislative branch, but not so well in the executive.
Then what would be the point of having advisors?
To advise.
Well, you have advisors, but you don't have to take their advice, I guess. You're not obliged to take their advice, right? That's different.
But I'll go back to my favorite word, malleability. The executive says, we're going to go do this. And they find out that's not exactly right. Well, okay, we'll do that over there a little bit.
Yeah.
Whereas the legislature passed a law that said, this is the law. This is the law.
Yeah.
It's different.
If it's okay, I'm gonna read just the last line of this. It's on page 5, and it's about line 32. I was actually very struck by this. I will only add that prior to the appearance of the Constitution, I rarely met with an intelligent man from any of the states who did not admit, as the result of experience, that the unity of the executive of this state was one of the best of the distinguishing features of our Constitution.
Or you take that to mean New York's.
Yeah. I mean, in other words, actually, this is kind of going back. Last time, 2 weeks ago, we talked a lot about the governor of New York gets brought up as an example many times, right? So that you have the unity of the executive of a state, right, is very distinguishing, and I guess what effective, right? So
Yeah, other state governors were really weak. They would be completely bulldozed by their legislatures.
Yeah.
The New York governor, George Clinton, held several terms, and he had a strong veto power and a strong commander-in-chief power.
Yeah, that got brought up. Steve, you were going to say?
Sorry.
Exactly our conversation from last time about the fact that I think Hamilton's example or his intent in bringing up New York, and specifically Clinton in this case, was the fact that, hey, look at all the power that Clinton's got. We're giving you an executive that's weaker than that, and we're going to have checks in there that are at least more stringent than the ones that New York has. So I think that's, if I remember, that was kind of one of the conversations we had last time. He's giving that as an example and saying, hey, we're not even giving it that much power as New York has.
Right. Sean, your hand's up.
I tend to wonder how far into the future he saw this, especially in light of the line Andy just read for us about as a result of experience, unities of the executive branch is best. They had just come through rebelling against Great Britain, which was far from unanimous. And this group of men who were doing the governing, it was anything but, a united front trying to struggle through. And I think that experience maybe is a good way to read into this line, like, hey, I don't know that he's talking about the day-to-day running of government, but I think he says we need to have an executive when it really matters, or an executive branch when it really matters, like existential crisis of the nation, that they need to be able to act quickly and firmly. I don't know that he envisioned our present state of affairs.
Yeah.
And
Arthur, your hand's up.
So I might be confused. The issue, the question that was raised by Rachel, and when she read the paragraph, and that resolution is a law and resistance to it is punishable, but no favorable circumstance palliate or atone for the disadvantages of dissension in the executive department.
Yeah.
I know there was discussion after that regarding the legislature and the president, but then Kevin mentioned it, which is the reason I went back and looked at it. I mean, this paragraph seems to just talk about dissension in the executive department. That's basically what you were saying, Kevin?
Yeah. I mean, dissension with Congress is a good thing.
Yeah.
That's checks and balances, right?
Right.
Dissension within the executive department, that's a problem because it has to be unified. And remember too, I mean, cabinet members aren't just advisors, they're also ministers.
Yeah.
In other countries, they'd be called ministers. They help govern. That means they have to answer to the president who stands at the top of that pyramid.
So once the president meeting with the cabinet members, and there's usually dissension among cabinet members, I imagine, and everything, but once the president makes his decision, then the cabinet has to come together, at least the way this envisages. Okay, thank you very much.
And that's why he appoints them, so they're answerable to him, and that's why you can fire them. So.
Yeah. Okay, well, it's 6:39. We went over 9 minutes. So what I want to do is I will put it on the website. It'll be June 1st. And what we're going to do on June 1st is we'll do 78, which is the Judiciary, and then 85, which is kind of the bookend, the conclusion of the Federalist Papers. So 78 and 85 on June 1st. And then what we'll do after that will be a couple of Anti-Federalist Papers that we can read to see the arguments, which will be a lot of fun. And then the Constitution will be after that. So we'll just kind of methodically go through the entire Constitution and then the amendments. So anyway, thank you.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you. It's been really great.
Andy.
It was a lot of fun.
Good evening, and I'll email all of you. And if you're not getting my emails and you want to, please go to the chat and send me your email if